Hello, everybody, and welcome. And I'm about to bring to the stage now, joining me from all the way over there, it's Kit Clarenberg. Kit,
Hello. Hey, how's it going?
it's busy times here in the land of the always perfidious Albion.
No,
Um, our
absolutely.
our beloved Prime Minister has been giving the game away in various statements that he's made this week. I'm sure we'll come to that later. But how are things in the once and future Yugoslavia?
Yeah, well, Julian Assange once very aptly described Serbia as the land where the future happens first.
Mm.
I think that we are spectating events elsewhere within Europe, within the Middle East, with a mixture of dread, but also bitter amusement, because like we've been warning you that this would happen in every way for a very long
Mm.
time, and now it's playing out. There's a great line by the independent journalist Mark Ames, which is the history never ended here. It just got jammed up a bit for a brief period of time. Aside from that said, we look at events elsewhere. By comparison, Serbia is looking pretty stable and in some ways prosperous in comparison. Because we've already been through the color revolutions and the bombings and the neoliberalism imposed at the barrel of a gun. We've seen this. We can see this coming. Again, interesting times that we're living in right now, I think.
Indeed, indeed. And one of those interesting things is, of course, as you imply in your comment there, the same tactics that were deployed for many years, not just in the 90s, but leading up to the 90s as well in Yugoslavia, have been applied successfully to Syria this week. And just to clarify what I'm talking about here, maybe you want to comment on this as well. The decade that led up to the breakout, the civil wars, the breaking away of Slovenia and Croatia, saw the US, as Michael Parenti analyzes in his book, identify the destruction of the last elements of socialism and the unified state in Yugoslavia as a national security priority. This is 1984. So they used the economic problems that the Yugoslav government was facing to insist upon a series of so-called reforms, which in actual fact was about letting their proxies run riot in Bosnia, in Croatia, and in Slovenia especially. And this was joined with them starving or attempting to starve the Yugoslav federal government of funding, right up to the point where they were saying, unless you allow literally our fascist proxies to tear the country to pieces, we'll deny you any economic aid, which, as we all know, economic aid is just basically another gun to the head. And this is indeed what essentially triggered, in my interpretation, the collapse of the authority of the federal government of Yugoslavia, especially over those regions where they had allowed the fascist proxies of the Americans and the British and the Germans to run riot and caused the situation that broke out there post 1991. And if we look at the Syrian situation, well, there's an awful lot of familiarity there, isn't there? But I'll invite your comment on my interpretation of that and the similarities here first.
Yeah, sure. First, I must apologise for how garbled my initial statement on this program was. I have one eye on an extremely naughty staffy that I've just adopted. So to misquote who is doing all sorts of crazy things in the background. To misquote Kool and the Gang, don't blame it on the good times, don't blame it on the bad times, blame it on the staffy. But in all seriousness, is that I think that one of the most striking things to emerge from this kind of this quagmire of information, misinformation, claims, counterclaims, finger pointing, is that The Economist, which I think everyone listening to this broadcast, or I should at least hope so, knows Vladimir Lenin's appraisal of what The Economist is and who it's for. They announced that one of the first acts of the kind of interim government, if you can even call it that, in newly quote unquote liberated Syria, was that they would be adopting market reforms. Now, it is rather forgotten, not least due to the absolutely grinding civil war, that Syria, in the post-Cold War period, kind of stood apart in the region for having a mixed market, I guess capitalists would call it a state-dominated economy, which is to say that there was nationalized industry, that there was public services which were by and large free or subsidized at the point of use, and also Syria eschewed Western financial infiltration by the usual suspects, whether that's the IMF and World Bank or organizations like BlackRock and Morgan Stanley. They didn't have that. And they were very keen that this not happen. And I, for a very long time, assumed that this was one of the key underlying drivers of the war in Syria. One, but among many, but a significant one. And that the fact that this is amidst all of this footage emerging of like massacres and people looting in the street and just kind of total chaos, the government has managed to eke out a statement that they will be adopting market reforms. And yes, it's very similar to what happened in Yugoslavia, as you say, which is, and I think that there is another important point to make here as well, and it does kind of tie into the Syrian experiences too. This is something that I've written about, which is that effectively during the Cold War, Yugoslavia was effectively bribed by the empire to not go communist. Now, yes. They were given loans at very competitive rates in order to be a kind of in order to maintain their position as a middle way between the Soviet Union and the West, but also act as a thorn in the side of the Soviet Union. And I have written an article about this called Yugoslavia's Propaganda Value for British Spies. You can find it on my eponymous website. But what I think is quite interesting is that as I document in my investigation, the British intelligence propagandists were very, very keen to market Yugoslavia's alternative, quote unquote, third way model to the global south during the 1960s, when you have this kind of upsurge of independence throughout Africa and Asia, and you have the kind of collapse of most European empires. My suspicion is that one of the reasons they were keen to promote this was not only to prevent countries or tried to prevent countries turning to the Soviet Union and adopting the Soviet Union's economic model for ideological reasons. It was also intended that countries doing this wouldn't realize that the West could pull the rug out from under them at any point they wished, which is exactly what happened in the 1980s in Yugoslavia, as you correctly noted. So, in Yugoslavia, you had a mixed market economy with quite a heavy borrowing from the West to fund this. In 1980, the IMF and the World Bank effectively demanded out of nowhere that this money be repaid immediately. And unable to keep up with debt repayments, the IMF and the World Bank did what they always do, which is to carve up the country effectively. And it got to such was that you mentioned Michael Parenti's To Kill a Nation. He documents how effectively these institutions, i.e. the US empire, took over the running of Yugoslavia's economy, and they were circumventing and ignoring the federal government. It's really quite extraordinary. I don't want to go off on a tangent here. I just strongly recommend people read Parenti's work and indeed my investigation, because I do go into this. But the point is that Syria was, throughout the Cold War, was aligned with the Soviet Union. This of course, due to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, this somewhat changed, but their economy didn't. And I mean, in the Yugoslav context, it took a decade of crippling sanctions and proxy wars throughout the former Yugoslavia, and a 78-day-long bombing campaign, and a color revolution in Serbia to force Belgrade to accept neoliberal, quote unquote, economic reforms. In the case of Syria, it has taken with a very similar playbook with some of the same individuals involved, I might add. It took a decade of grinding proxy war, and also the most crippling sanctions I think ever employed by the US government. They were called the Caesar sanctions, and the US officials have boasted how before there was a quote unquote high bar to proving that a organization or person was breaching sanctions by doing business or trading or investing in a sanctioned country. Under the Caesar Act, there was no bar at all. Anyone spending any money in Syria in any regard got sanctioned. It destroyed the value of their currency. It made the price of very basic goods, completely unaffordable for average Syrians. It destroyed salaries. It destroyed entire sections of the economy. Of course, you have the US occupation of of Syria's oil fields like during this time, so they couldn't even get income that way. And yeah, I see this as a very key reason for the collapse of the Assad government, because not only did it create an upswell of negative public sentiment towards the government, but it also meant that the kind of state security and military apparatus were living on salaries of about $15 a month, which bought you nothing in heavily sanctioned Syria. It created a lack of motivation for these people to fight to protect their homeland, and it created the ripe foundations for Assad's removal. And as I think we'll get into in due course, I think this was one of the key factors, not only from behind the collapse of the Assad government, not just in practical terms as I've just outlined, but also from the perspective of Syria's foreign sponsors. But yeah, that's a discussion for later.
Yes, and just to follow up on one of the points you're making there, the central demand of the imperialists all the way through the Cold War period to countries like Yugoslavia was that they, of course, as time went on and the imperialist needs to collapse these countries intensified, was that they then destroy all remaining socialistic elements in the system, to basically cut out the support for the system that remained in the working class and the peasantry in a lot of these areas. And this is a demand they always make to every single socialist or socialistic government, which is that it sever the connection with the masses, which is the strongest point of any socialist government, is the ability to mobilize the masses in defense of the nation. And so the imperialists aren't stupid. They know where their strengths of their enemies lie, and they want to get you to basically, essentially, sabotage yourself and destroy your own capacity to fight, ideally without them firing a shot, or at least getting their mercenaries to do the shooting for them. And they even managed to do this thanks to the weakness of Soviet revisionism with the USSR itself, with the Khrushchev and then the Brezhnev era leaderships adopting ridiculous things like the Helsinki Declaration and the various different human rights commitments, which were much like the Yugoslav case. These were just building blocks towards what? They were building blocks towards allowing the fascist organizations, which are sponsored by the West, to roam free inside the countries. That's what this was. The demands were all about. All the guff about human rights, about freedom of speech, and all those other fucking buzzwords that the various unmentionable characters on the left that we may come to later loved to spout in the Cold War, and still spout to this day. What does it all come down to? You must allow, say the imperialists, our fascists to roam free. And if you don't, then we'll tell you you're undemocratic. Because this is exactly what happened in for instance, I've mentioned it before, the interview I recently did with a Latvian comrade about the Baltic states. Gorbachev gave in to all the demands about allowing the various different fascistic organizations to essentially run riots in the Baltic states. And what happened? Eventually, socialism in the Baltic states got undermined and collapsed. And this is what they always do. And to go back to the Syrian example, this is exactly what they did with the government of Bashar al-Assad: starve the population and try and cut away the pillars of support that the government did have. And eventually, they even managed, I would argue, and here we can pivot into the discussion of the collapse itself. They even managed, I think, to cut away the support of Iran and Russia by organizing a reorientation inside the Syrian government itself, via the influence of the Gulf states on the Syrian government, with promises of money and promises of sanctions relief if the government essentially distanced itself from Russia and Iran. Now, I wouldn't mention this if it just came from one source, but we've now got this from about 4 or 5 different places, all saying the same thing. So, what is your analysis as to that theory, as to the collapse, and do you think that this was just it was a case of the people around Assad reorientating and then basically leaving him in a minority of one, which is why essentially he had to resign and then quit? Or do we think that, as the Iranians claim, that he himself had essentially given up the fight, but maybe we're into speculative territory there?
Yeah, I mean, this goes into what I was saying earlier about, like, there's a lot of claims and counterclaims and finger pointing going on at the moment, and I think that I mean, it would be a kind of ascendant narrative at the moment is that Assad basically sold out his allies for economic and political gain. There is a grain of truth to that. I think it's just one component of like a wider a wider constellation of reasons why this happened. But it's like, yeah, I think that basically that I mean, this is, again, to go back to the Cold War, Syria was during the particularly during the latter stages of the Cold War, was under Baathism, was a kind of key call it a beachhead or jumping off point for anti-imperialist actions overseas. So, for instance, very few people know this, but Syria provided shelter and safe havens to resistance fighters from all over the world, including the rather infamous Carlos the Jackal. In 1989, when you have the collapse of the Warsaw Pact states, and the Syrian government pivoted from its historical position as a ally of the Soviet Union and started, to an extent, cozying up with the West. Now, there is some pretty amazing footage which I've shared on. I saw it doing the rounds on social media, and I think it's extraordinary how prescient this clip is. In it, Gaddafi, I think this is from 2008.
I will play it now. I'll play it now.
Okay, please do.
Okay. So here we go. So just to pause here, this is Gaddafi addressing the Arab League in 2008. And he starts off by saying, an entire Arab government executed, yet we sit on the sidelines. Why? Any one of you could be next, yes? And indeed, he was right. And it's not just the footage concludes with Assad laughing at him, but they're all laughing at him. Yeah, they're all the popular image of Gaddafi at the time was this sort of crazed eccentric, but as we're about to see, he was indeed correct. And there's Assad laughing at him. He's saying there, America fought alongside Saddam Hussein against Khomeini. Khomeini was their, Saddam was their friend. He was their friend. Cheney was a friend of Saddam Hussein. Well, I wouldn't say that. I think the colonel was a bit hyperbolic there, but Dick Cheney doesn't have friends. But I know what you mean.
No.
He mentions there Donald Rumsfeld, who, of course, there's a famous photo in 1983 of Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, which Rumsfeld was asked about once and basically said, well, that was then, this is now, which is a remarkably honest answer. Ultimately, they sold him out and they hanged him, says Gaddafi. You are friends of America. Let's say that. We are not you. But one of these days, America may hang us. And there you go. A prescient piece of film with not just Assad laughing at him, but all of them laughing at him. And what is really remarkable to me and is that if you're a leader in a country which is in the crosshairs of the empire, which all of them were and are, by the way, the ability of certain of these leaders to believe that the assurances of the US and the British that, oh, don't worry, we're on good terms. Well, as Henry Kissinger once said, it is dangerous to be the enemy of America, but to be a friend is deadly. And so it proved. I mean, in the case of the Iraq war, the Iran-Iraq war, for instance, which Gaddafi mentions there, the US ended up using that basically to try and destroy Iran. And when they couldn't destroy it, ended up weakening the Ba'athist government in Iraq by indebting it to the Gulf states and the Saudis to the point where it was basically heading towards bankruptcy. So that was, of course, at a time when the US was heavily funding and arming the Iraqi government, only to, of course, betray Saddam Hussein and, as Gaddafi says, kill him just over 14, 15 years after the end of the war in which the US had played the major role in instigating or getting the Ba'athists in Baghdad to instigate for them. So Gaddafi proven completely correct. And what's remarkable to me is the way that so many of these people in positions of leadership simply didn't learn the lesson, which is like you'd think that people in the West Asian region, with all the history of the British lying to everybody, stitching up everybody, you'd think that they would learn, but apparently they don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite remarkable, isn't it? And I think that I mean, on top of Gaddafi's comments being amazingly, eerily, spookily prescient, I think that footage it speaks to a key weakness that Assad always always had, and actually, funnily enough, again in the manner of Yugoslavia, was that he attempted to pursue a kind of third way, even after the Cold War, where he tried to cozy up the Baathists attempted to cozy up to the West, if only for the purposes of self-preservation, but they kind of got drawn in a bit deeper, and in the process, the successive Syrian administrations thought that and actually Gaddafi himself as well, of course, thought that they were a lot tighter with the West than they actually were. Now, it's rather forgotten that Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of the former Prime Minister of Britain, he cozied up to Assad. Assad was in the running for knighthood. Syria was part of the CIA's extraordinary rendition program. So, I mean, and while this clip was filmed, this was happening. So, of course, Assad finds the notion ludicrous because, well, they need me more than I need them. And I think that, I mean, this was his downfall in general, and then he didn't really see that what was happening in 2011, if not before, when Qatar, Israel, and Britain and America moved to get rid of him and started fomenting uprisings against him and Sunni Shia war throughout West Asia more generally. But also, I think that once the war was kind of over, even though it wasn't really, it was a kind of ceasefire without any set parameters on when the fighting would resume. So Syria, once the main battles were kind of won in 2019, late 2019 and early 2020, it remained occupied by the US. There was a kind of Kurdish self-declared state or principality in the north, Rojava, and there was also a large number of extremist groups who, on paper, quite literally, had signed reconciliation agreements with the government, but remained kind of anti-Assad agitators. And then, at the start of last year, you had this massive earthquake which affected Turkey and Syria and Iraq and that particular kind of part of Eurasia, excuse me, and attempts by the Assad government to get aid to areas of Syria affected by the earthquake were hindered or even outright prevented by these extremist groups, which continue to kind of crisscross throughout the country. But so I think that as well during this period, after the war was theoretically over, but still kind of close to simmering again. Assad did begin outreach with, I might add, encouragement from the Iranians. Did start outreach and trying to resolve his issues with the Gulf states. And I made this point on Twitter, and it bears repeating: is that I think that Assad got a bit distracted or perhaps deluded by the fact that he was meeting with Gulf leaders who had plotted his downfall and attending Arab League summits again. And I think that he saw that as, well, I've won now, and that victory is permanent. But not only that, is that I think that, that basically he was, and this is a reasonable calculation to make from a geopolitical perspective, he thought that becoming chummy with the Gulf states, because they are Western puppets signed up to the Zionist project, it would end Syria's international isolation. It would result in the easing of sanctions, and it might get Israel to stop bombing Syria indiscriminately every now and then. However, in the process, he forgot that these scumbags who run the Gulf states are Western puppets signed up to the Zionist agenda, who would quite literally sell out their own mothers for political gain. So, I mean, this is rather forgotten. Like, I mean, in at the start of November, Assad attended an Arab summit and gave a speech about like the plight of the Palestinians and how we must as Muslims all support the Palestine solidarity struggle. And it's like, not only was he surrounded in that room by people who had been plotting to overthrow him via, violent means and Gaddafi him. I mean, I'm sure they would have. I'm sure Mohammed bin Salman would have loved to see Assad, anally penetrated by a bayonet in the manner of Gaddafi. Is that I think that he felt that he was kind of back in the club, and that this was a kind of perpetual upward trajectory for Syria. Now, I might add as well, on October 7th this year, it was announced that Iranian lawmakers were trying to forge a dedicated axis of resistance pact, which would in many ways emulate NATO. So it would have a formal centralized command and control structure. It would have mutual defense components similar to NATO's Article 5. If one of us is attacked, all of us are attacked. I reported on this at the time because I think and remain convinced that it was a very significant move, to create this formal alliance, as it were. What did jump out to me at the time, and it kind of reverberates now, is the fact that in all public statements related to this proposed resistance pact, Syria was unmentioned.
Yes.
And so you had all of these Iranian lawmakers and leaders talking about Hezbollah and Ansarallah and resistance groups in Iraq, but they didn't mention the Syrian Arab Army, and they didn't mention Assad. And that stuck out to me at the time. And it is quite clear that, yes, that under under kind of Gulf inducement or pressure, depending on your perspective, he did try and distance himself somewhat from Iran and Russia, which was a very foolhardy move to make, given that they were not only the first line of defense for Syria, but like pretty much the entirety of Syria's defense against foreign incursions. The Syrian Arab Army was heavily hollowed out by the war. As I mentioned, its soldiers and even military chiefs were living on virtually no money at all. They were not very well equipped, particularly to do very much of anything apart from attempt to shoot down or fire back at Israeli airstrikes. So that like in the process, Syria was one way or another left defenseless, and we can get into this, but I think that the lack of will to fight by at least some elements of the Syrian Arab Army did not go unnoticed in Moscow and Tehran. So when this erupted, there was a sense of, well, if they're not willing to fight, we're not either. And I also, there have been some catastrophically bad takes on this from some prominent geopolitical analysts, who I won't bother naming because it's petty. But it's like, I think that basically I've seen some people claim that there is this kind of grand six-dimensional chess move being pulled off by Tehran and Moscow and blah blah. I don't think that's true. I think that just in the manner of kind of real, like kind of two-fisted, cold-hearted realpolitik, Assad was not seen as a reliable or particularly useful ally to have. In fact, in many ways, he was more of a drain on resources and a bit of a liability than he was an asset. And I mean, several more sober analysts, including, I'll give them a shout out, Armchair Warlord, have made the point that, well, you have Ansarallah, who have made this huge contribution to the axis of resistance and the battle against Zionist genocide. The Syrian Arab Army didn't do anything, like literally nothing, like for the entire year. They're on more than a year now, the year and 2 months that this has been ongoing. And so a decision may have been made that he wasn't worth saving, and actually, maybe, just maybe, a Syria or a Syria broken into mutually resentful microstates, where you have a kind of Kurdish breakaway state, a HTS dominated or governed central government, as it were, and then all sorts of warring factions and different kind of proxy sponsors, the US, Britain, Turkey. Actually, it might have suited Russia and in Iran's interest better to have Syria descend into this state of kind of internecine chaos than be dragged into an all-out conflict. Now, I mean, in practical terms as well, and I think this is there's been some reporting on this which has largely gone unremarked upon even in the mainstream, but I think it's highly significant, is that that one of the reasons that HTS were able to overrun certain elements of the Syrian Arab Army was they had the Ukrainians running a horde of first-person view drones, which meant that the HTS could at all times monitor where the Syrian Arab Army was and what they were doing. And now this meant that the Syrian Arab Army didn't really have a chance. More generally, a point which both which governments, militaries, and civilian populations the world over are kind of continue to miss, is that these drones are a huge game changer in terms of how wars are fought. And I mean, you have Ansarallah is they kind of defeated the US Navy by just bombarding US naval ships and Western shipping in the Red Sea with drones costing about $20, which the US Navy used missiles costing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to shoot down. But the Syrians didn't have this capability or understand its significance. So the rapid collapse isn't actually like that surprising on a technical level. And I might add that like Brian Beletic, who is this a very credible and pretty much consistently right on geopolitical analyst himself, a US military veteran, has written about why the Syrian Arab army folded so quickly. It wasn't because of some grand deal being struck between different regional powers. It was just because they didn't have the will or the ability to fight properly.
Yeah, and the point is, and I've just pulled up the David Ignatius article there, where he's bragging about essentially the American role in transporting Ukrainians over to fight with this, what is in essence a mercenary army. I mean, these various groups in Syria use names that sound very radical to a Western ear, but in reality, HTS, Al Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic State, ISIS or ISIL. These are all just different variations of mercenary operations that are funded almost exclusively by the US, the British, the French to a certain extent, and also with a big role played by the Turkish military and intelligence services in organizing them. These are mercenary operations. These are run by men who are long-term agents. Like Giuliani is quite clearly a long-term project of the British and the Americans. They even like gave him a makeover. Though somebody hilariously on Twitter identified the branding of combat jacket he had on as one that is made in northern Israel. So he's even dressed by an Israeli wardrobe. He's Israel coated, so to speak. But the point about all of this is that the internal collapse wasn't just military; it was political as well. Because what's been missed in a lot of the overheated commentary is the fact that the prime minister, Assad's last prime minister, remained in place, as did quite a lot of his cabinet, and did this deal nominally with HTS, but really with those behind them. So the Turks, the Israelis, and behind them, of course, the US and the British, to stay in place and form this sort of unity government, so-called. And Assad was shown the door by his own guys, basically. And also the generals who had won that fight in up to 2019, who had, with the assistance of the Russians and the Iranians, thrown back the various different mercenary groups into Idlib, they were dismissed, apparently, from around about the 2020 mark. And people more to the liking of the Gulf states, i.e., traitors or people who are completely corrupt and useless, were brought in. Now, I'm going to keep talking because my co-host here appears to have what is generally referred to in the trade as laptop difficulty. Hello, you still there, mate? You've lost your visuals.
Yeah. Oh yeah, sorry about that. No, I'm very much still here. Sorry. I can't even blame it on the Staffy. I'm still here.
But this is why I say that the Gulf states played a more subtle game over the last 5 years than they did over the previous decade, which is they got essentially what they needed via moving money around, making promises and influencing people, rather than just simply using brute force. In the end, there was around about 800 casualties from this last military operation, which is still significant, of course, but compared to the level of casualties that had existed in the previous war, it's a relatively short operation that was over in purely military terms, with relatively low casualty numbers, because simply one side did not fight. And that says again that's the ideal Western war, which is where you hollow out your opponent via sanctions and via internal degradation, then you just need to give a light push and the whole house of cards falls over. This is, I think, and again, I'd like to get your opinion on this. This is what they thought they could do with Russia. This is, I think, what the British especially were convinced of this, that if they hammered it with enough sanctions, they could do the same thing, that they could somehow hollow out the Putin-led government, that they could then, once all they needed to do, once the hostilities really kicked off in 2022, was to score a couple of basically information space victories, make it look as if the Ukrainians could win, even though they all knew very well that they couldn't. Then the palace coup would come. Then the dastardly Putin would be ushered out, and we get a victory video from Sebastian Gorka saying, "The Asiatic mind has been defeated again, sir." And this is really, I think they were wrongly convinced that this would happen, because this is the way they want to fight their wars, which is relatively low cost in terms of certainly American and British lives, reliant upon sanctions and information warfare, and essentially convincing elements of the hierarchy on the other side to defect. And if they can do that, then they can pull off the victory that they were looking for. What's your opinion on that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, and funnily enough, I mean, as we've discussed on a previous broadcast, my reporting for the Grey Zone on Project Alchemy, this group of quote unquote sideways thinkers created by the Ministry of Defence to come up with all sorts of insane plans for trying to capsize the Kremlin and balkanize Russia. I think that the Western powers very much sought, with Britain in the lead, to emulate what happened in Syria. Now, I mean, the war kicked off so long ago that there is this entire generation of people who either weren't around at the time or were too young to have an interest, or just weren't paying attention for one reason or another. That's forgivable. But yeah, and I have written about this for my website, and there is more forthcoming. That one of the key things that they tried to do in Syria was encourage defections, and I think that it's quite. There was a document circulated by the Syrian opposition activists in Lebanon in May 2011, which openly talked about trying to encourage defections of high-ranking military people. This is what happened in Libya as well, of course, and you had the MI6 front Quilliam Foundation at the forefront of that. Was that they thought that in Russia they could encourage the same. So in a forthcoming, we're not quite done with Project Alchemy at the Grey Zone. There is there are some other documents that we have not yet revealed, in which it is discussed between these lunatics, these intelligence and military veterans who comprise Project Alchemy, that, well, the reason that we need to attack Kerch Bridge, which happened in October 2022, and was plotted by the British many months in advance, was because it was Putin's quote-unquote crowning glory following the reunification of Russia and Crimea in 2014, that an attack on Kerch Bridge could be interpreted by people within Putin's circle as a sign of the Tsar's demise. And that this would then trigger, all of these defections. And I think that, I mean, this is a point that's important to make, is that, outside a bunch of, liberal opposition activists in Moscow, who everyone hated anyway, the number of defections from Russia to the West since this started, naught. No serious politician, even on a regional level, has has thrown in with the West over this. There have been no major military or intelligence defections. There have been isolated examples of members of the Russian military who have defected. There was that guy who stole a helicopter, killed its crew, and flew over to Ukraine, who turned up dead in rather brutal circumstances in Spain. Treachery is not forgiven in Russia, and with good reason. but yeah, that like I think that this was another major miscalculation by Assad, was that it didn't occur. It may not have occurred to him that the fact that there were so many high-profile defections, a decade ago, if not before, and the creation of this parallel Western puppet alternative Syrian government that was involved in talks at the UN about the shape of the future Syria. It didn't occur to him that actually that his level of the extent to which he could trust people around him was probably not very significant. And again, in a situation where you have soldiers living off $15 a day, people are quite easily bored. Now, when the war between Israel and Lebanon kicked off in October, I drew attention to some things that I wrote for The Cradle, a great independent media outlet, years ago, about British penetration of Lebanon's military intelligence and security structure. And you have British personnel posted to the headquarters of Lebanon's internal security forces, and all sorts of other none of this is public. Within these documents, there are references to the kind of fees that they pay to members of Lebanon's political and military and security elites in return for this access. And I mean, from the West perspective, it's not that much money in the scheme of things. In Lebanon, which has had this kind of ongoing financial crisis and just the kind of total collapse of its state, it's an enormous amount of money. And so I think, one of the there have been reports, unconfirmed, that there were people at high levels within the Syrian Arab army who were passing intelligence and secrets to Israel and Turkey and HTS in advance of this, were deliberately making mistakes, quote unquote, and kind of oiling the wheels of Assad's removal, because he was actually, rather isolated within this system. I mean, and this is I think there's another reason that foreign powers wanted Syria to be broken up into pieces, was that Assad oversaw a truly multi-ethnic government. That all religious and ethnic minorities in Syria, of which there are many, were represented in every major government department. And this was something that was very popular. And there was this article in Al Jazeera at the start of 2011, which referred to Syria as the quote unquote silent kingdom, or some phrase to that effect, where it interviewed average Syrians who said, well, we don't want a Arab Spring style revolution to happen here, because there are all of these different groups living amongst one another who will likely be turned on each other as a result of this. Now we are seeing footage of Alawites being massacred, fleeing the country. Assad put a lid on that internal strife. I mean, similar to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. I've seen a lot of people express kind of shock at the naivety of Assad for not being able to see that he was effectively, like Caesar, kind of surrounded by enemies, and that he was dancing a dangerous jig with the Gulf states, given their history of attempting to overthrow him. But I mean, we see this level of naivety with the new government, if you can even call it that, of Syria, where they are, having been assisted into power by Israel, they're now complaining that Israel is continuing to bomb Syria without compunction. And they're just and it's just like, I mean, what did you expect?
Well, but Benjamin Netanyahu said, we want good relations. And by good relations, he meant basically, you give me the south of Syria, I will let you rule what is left. That's it. I mean, the reason why the US and the Israelis have done this very significant bombing campaign over Syria, eliminating all of this Russian military equipment, Russian and old Soviet military equipment, that some of which is quite advanced, is because whatever state formation emerges there has to be a weak state, which is essentially isn't allowed a real army, never mind an air force or a navy. Where any armed force that is allowed to exist is there going to be created only for the purposes of internal repression, like the Lebanese army is, which is overseen by foreign officers. It's a colonial force, basically. And its job will be to enforce the property claims of largely Western corporations in line with the new free market economic model. And I said this in a post on X, that the reason for a lot of the violence, I mean, some of it is just what happens when an ultra-reactionary mercenary gang takes over. This is, the violence and slaughter follows. Some of it, though, is terror by a certain amount of design, which is to break down completely old economy and state. You have to terrorize and destroy the key supporting elements to it, so that when you implement your new order, then there's fewer people left to do anything practical. You could do anything practical to oppose you. And this is the reason why there was so much violence and madness in Libya, which hasn't ended. It's part of the reason why they're engaging in this violence now. Whatever state is to emerge, if we go off the wants of the US, the British, and probably definitely the Israelis, and what the agenda of the Turks is questionable at this stage. Certainly, maybe a land grab, I don't know. But they don't want a Syria that is sovereign, that is capable of defending itself, or is capable of resisting the claims made over its resources and territory by the multinational corporations. And I think that's undeniable, because that's what they've done elsewhere. And just to go back to your point about it's being a multi-religious and multi-ethnic state, that is the last thing that the imperialists want. They want as many micro ethno states as possible, ideally fighting with each other, so they can sit in the middle and say, we're the only ones who can guarantee peace. Because this, just to conclude my thoughts on this particular issue, this is the original British plan for Palestine. Put the Zionists in there, let them have a micro state, have the Arabs there with their own state, have the British in the middle running their mandate and saying, no one else can guarantee peace between these dreadful Arabs and these dreadful Zionists but us. We're keeping the peace, which is the tactic the Americans use all the time as well. And it's what they will do or try to do here. I can only hope that the Syrians can soon build a resistance that can drum these people out of there, but it's going to be hard going. Just another point related to this, though. Our beloved Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, was in Cyprus just the other day. And this relates back to what you were saying about the British operations in Lebanon. And, of course, the British operation that Declassified UK, that site is chronicled in terms of providing intelligence for the Israeli slaughter in Gaza. Starmer said in a remarkable... He has the ability to make strange confessions when he's trying to look tough. And he went there and he says, you are defending our interests here, and we can't say what you are doing, but it's very important. Basically saying that whatever they're up to, it's some deeply shady stuff. And he's basically just gone on record and admitting that there's no way he can talk about it. But I suppose that this is, of course, entirely unsurprising to a man such as yourself, and who has chronicled the activities of the British. But a strange confession for a sitting prime minister to make. Normally, he would say something like, "Well, they're defending democracy or liberty or human rights," but he's just basically said, "Whatever what you're doing is important, but it's too shady for me to talk about."
Yeah, I mean, I was absolutely stunned by that, because it's actually not too dissimilar to public debates in Israel on whether they should admit to having a nuclear weapon or not. It's a bit like well, even if you're good at admit as you've as good as admitted it anyway. But this is entirely in keeping with in November last year. It might have been late October. This rather shadowy British Ministry of Defence MI5 and MI6 run body called the Defence and Security Advisory Committee, which dictates what the media in Britain can report on matters of national security, which is of course a very broad term and field. They wrote to newspaper editors saying, we don't want anyone discussing the fact that the SAS are involved in quote unquote counter-terror operations in Gaza, and we can use our imaginations as to what the SAS is up to in Gaza as a result. But yeah, I mean, it was almost him saying the quiet part out loud, but remaining quiet. Yeah, a remarkable statement of well done guys for all the sterling work you're doing, whatever that is, and I think it's just like that. I mean, and I sent you this, and I'm not sure if you can get it up, but there was something that really I think that, I mean, and Starmer has also made statements about how now that Syria has fallen, Britain's role in the Middle East,
yes,
to use this colonial terminology, will increase now. Something that really struck me this was on October 8th, 2023. So this is about 24 hours or slightly more after Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, Hamas's incursion into Israel began. Robert Peston, who is this kind of veteran British client journalist who is just writes and says whatever he's told by government sources, said he took to X or Twitter to state that British intelligence sources had informed him that what's going to happen now most likely is a major regional war with huge ramifications for the world, and so on and so on. Now, I asked at the time, and I've kept on asking, how did British intelligence know, given that they didn't apparently foresee Operation Al-Aqsa Flood? How did they know 24 hours after it started, when an Israeli response hadn't even begun, that there was going to be a major world-changing war? As a result of this, we can use our imaginations as to why, and I think very obvious answer is that they were going to make this happen. Now, since then, there has been reporting in local media in Lebanon that the British were seeking permission from the Lebanese government to have armed British soldiers be granted freedom of movement anywhere they wished in Lebanon, access to all of the country's ports, airports, and land and sea territory, and be totally immune from prosecution for any crime whatsoever. We must ask ourselves, why would they want this? I mean, my surmise at the time was that they effectively wanted to create a tripwire whereby a war with Hezbollah could erupt with a stray trigger pull. The British, on top of all of this infiltration of Lebanese security and intelligence and military agencies, as also they are heavily embedded with the government of Lebanon. So, I mean, this kind of completely crazy request probably would have been granted if it hadn't have been leaked in advance.
yes.
But I mean, like, kind of my kind of take now is that is less that they wanted to create this tripwire, but it was a kind of preemptive occupation of the country in advance of something like we've just seen, which is to say the fall of Syria. Now, I might add that, I mean, we've discussed how the role of the axis of resistance here. I've seen an enormous amount of dooming, and I believe that a viewer wrote to us asking about this. I've seen a lot of people say, well, this is the end of Hezbollah. because Iran no longer has a land bridge via Syria to get weapons and other equipment to Hezbollah. Now, there are two key points to make here, which is that Syria was already, because of, as I mentioned, the enduring presence of extremist opposition groups, actually not a particularly safe or reliable means of getting anything to Hezbollah anyway. But I also might add as well that Hezbollah has an enormous stockpile of weapons supplied by Iran, and also some of which were supplied by Syria. Some analysts who really know their stuff did ask, when the war in South Lebanon with Israel began in October, why Hezbollah weren't just blitzing Israel's forces in southern Lebanon, and indeed blitzing Tel Aviv itself with hypersonic missiles that Israel and its regional allies and Western puppet masters can't shoot down. I think that the reason for that was because they suspected something like this could happen, so they were restricting their own use, of this material. Now, Iran has indicated a willingness to work with the opposition groups in Syria, so that land bridge is potentially not as compromised as one might think. But also, yes, they have managed to equip Ansarallah in Yemen, which is very, very, very far away from Iran. So, I mean, a bit different having to go through Anglo-dominated waters like the Suez Canal. But I don't think that this is the kind of crushing, fatal death blow against the resistance that a lot of doomy analysts believe it to be. But also as well, I mentioned how a calculation may have been made by Iran and Russia that they were, happy for Syria to be this kind of chaotic, unstable series, of unrecognized, self-declared statelets. But also, I think as well that, like, all of the regional powers involved in this potentially have bitten off more than that they can chew. I mean, for all of Netanyahu's bombastic braggadocio and his address from the Golan Heights, where he talked about how the Middle East has been reshaped forever, and we're going to this was foreshadowed by a since deleted op-ed in the Times of Israel about how Israel needs Lebensraum. That was the exact phrasing used.
They can't stop themselves, can they?
No. I mean, this is the same outlet that, in advance of the war in Lebanon, published a guide to whether Jews were biblically obligated to conquer the lands comprising Lebanon, and which they also deleted. But it's like, I do think that they've all overextended themselves. I mean, we've discussed this before, but there is a recurrent kind of obsession with Western thinking, which I think is very British, of let's get rid of our new designated Hitler successor, right? Like, it's like we see this with Russia, with Putin, where it's like, well, at all costs we need to get rid of Putin, but then what next? They haven't really thought about that and the consequences, and whether what replaces it will be considerably worse. So they finally got rid of Assad after more than well over a decade of meddling, arming and training and funding proxy fighters and extremist groups, wide-ranging psychological warfare campaigns. They finally gotten rid of him, and it's a bit like, well, now what? And actually, the issues that Israel was one of, the takeover of Syria happened during a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, which Israel specifically called for because they overextended themselves in Lebanon. And this is they invaded with much fanfare. They didn't get very far. They suffered significant losses, and then in the background, all of these issues which have been created by their failed war on Hamas, which is to say a collapsing economy, massive brain drain as people flee the settlers flee the country, and a whole host of economic issues. Those still exist. And so by pushing further into Syria, they might get there biblically mandated buffer zone, but they also have taken on more land than they can sustain at any point. Now, I mentioned how the figures within the Syrian opposition have started expressing bitterness and anger that Israel is continuing to bomb them. Well, I mean, they're on Israel's side for the time being. How much longer that can and will last is another question. I think, Turkey, Erdogan is on his way out, not only in political terms, but also, I mean, I think he's probably going to die quite soon. He's very old. So, this has been an ongoing effort for Erdogan for over a decade, is to basically create Ottoman Empire 2.0. But I mean, much like the British with their ill-fated belief in creating a quote-unquote global Britain post-Brexit, they don't have the wealth or the muscle to maintain anything like that. So actually, what may well have been intended as a trap for the Russians and the Iranians to fall into, which is trying to prop up the government of Assad, at a time that Russia is making enormous advances daily and is closing in on all sorts of highly economically and excuse me, I've got to stop smoking, a geopolitically significant territory. But this may have been, like I say, a trap, an intended trap, where it was hoped that the Russians and the Iranians would put up a hell of a fight, which would distract them from operations elsewhere. That hasn't happened. In the spirit of Kursk, which was a British operation, which was intended to draw Russia away from the front line in Donbass, which didn't happen. By quote unquote taking Syria so easily, the countries involved in this have potentially created massive liabilities for themselves, which they can't sustain. I mean, that Keir Starmer is talking a big game about how Britain is going to expand its operations and its presence in the Middle East. I mean, and this is while there is an ongoing strategic defense review initiated by Starmer, which has already led to massive cutbacks. And the vibe from media reporting on this and analysis in the Financial Times and other kind of elite mouthpieces is that, Britain just doesn't have the military it doesn't have the people, it doesn't have the wealth, and it doesn't have the resources to operate as a major power in any meaningful sense, and would last a few weeks in all-out war with Russia. I mean, in the spirit of, you can print money, but you can't print bullets or people or artillery shells or missiles. Well, I mean, Starmer can talk all he wants about how, this is going to, we are going to have a place east of Suez again. But I mean, again, are they setting themselves up for a quagmire trap here? They overextending themselves at a time when they can't even extend themselves at home?
Well, more than likely. I mean, this man is not particularly intelligent. He just does what the officialdom around him tell him to do. And that's been the basis of his entire career. What they will probably, not Starmer, he doesn't do the thinking. What the people who do the thinking may have in mind is basically trying to run either Syria or at least bits of it as some kind of protectorate that they will run in the manner of like the old East India Company. I mean, that's one of these people's big inspirations, historically speaking. So if your viewers aren't familiar with the history, the East India Company was famous for being a rapacious organization run by upper class scumbags, standard, but it operated through deals a lot of the time with local stooge regimes. It did its deals with various different Indian princelings, which is how it got so embedded in the country over the years. Some of the people in the Foreign Office and the think tanks are obsessed with this and think that they can sort of recreate it in modern times, which is why I think, to draw on what you were saying, they got so invested in the idea that they were going to basically give themselves complete freedom of operation in Lebanon, basically controlling it with a minimal footprint. They'll probably try to do something like controlling Syria, or at least elements of it, with a very minimal footprint and moving a lot of money around. That'll be their way of doing it. They can't have like the level of infrastructure that the British Empire used to have east of Suez. Like they've got a few ships in Qatar, which could be wiped out by an Iranian missile salvo. So it'll all be about moving money around. It'll be about running influencing and intelligence operations. It'll be about giving the likes of, your friend Chris Donnelly a budget and telling him to run wild in Syria, basically, and all kinds of scandals will come to light involving ludicrous operations, which usually go wrong. And in the end, the British will have to leave in a humiliating fashion. I don't think I'm even being too bold in my predictions there.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, this is a point that we've made again and again, but it does bear repeating. Is that like embarrassing Western retreats actually happen all the time. We just kind of forget about them. I mean, like the US invaded Lebanon and then ran away almost immediately with its tail between its legs in the 1980s. Because they thought, well, we're this invincible global empire and we can do whatever we want, and we've just bopped Grenada, we can go in and solve Lebanon's problems, and then they just ran away. Collapse of Afghanistan, after 20 years, we were told day in, day out by the mainstream media that Britain and the US, by token, and all of their vassals were creating this functioning state with its own military and its own security and intelligence agencies, created an enormous expense by the CIA and the Pentagon, etc. And then it just vanished within a day. Like within hours, and it's like, and I do think that, that currently the Yulani and all these other former quote unquote ISIS people are doing the rounds in the media, and they are being hailed as moderates and the faces of this like this new Syria. I mean, how long this can last? It very much remains to be seen. I mean, I mentioned, I think I might have mentioned this last week or the week before, that there was talk when the US pulled out of Afghanistan of Britain maintaining a international coalition there, and we see how long that idea lasted and how that turned out.
About 8 seconds.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, in keeping with the kind of the Yugoslavia analogy, one of the things that's really interesting is that there are senior US officials who have openly admitted that the reason that we destroyed Yugoslavia was because of its quote unquote resistance to the broader trends of economic and political reform in Europe, which is to say EU and NATO membership, neoliberal carve-ups, rape and pillage, destruction of local industry, and a population reduced to working for subsistence wages for Western corporations. But I mean, that was the objective. But I mean, while it has impoverished and immiserated the region to an enormous extent, I know a large number of people who really struggled to get by when they didn't during the 90s, when Serbia was like heavily sanctioned and like water was difficult to source sometimes, and its entire healthcare system collapsed as a result. While that was the objective, actually major Western corporations, because of the ethnic divisions, historical grievances, and political issues created by the deliberate destruction of Yugoslavia, it's actually made asset stripping and exploitation really, really, really difficult, or at least more difficult than US and British imperialists are willing to deal with. And there are all sorts of, because of its this multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-faith federation being carved up into little chunklets with mixed populations everywhere. There's all sorts of quarrels between people of which we know nothing, which are very difficult to resolve. Even on a basic level, it's like, well, who owns what? Well,
Yeah.
you have a Serb and an Albanian operated mine in Kosovo. Well, that's trying to navigate that is a bit too difficult for the US Imperial Brain Trust, who just want like easy returns. So
Yes.
even that planned rape and pillage hasn't really happened. And I think I can see that happening in Syria as well, where, as we've discussed, it is a ethnically and a highly ethnically and religiously diverse country. I'm sure that will change to a certain degree because there will be a large number of people killed and a large number of people will flee because it's just not safe. But it probably still won't be a particularly easy place for the West to do business or set up shop. And particularly I mentioned the Afghanistan example. There was all sorts of there was a series of reports published by the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, which got like zero media coverage. But they are if they were produced in a book, it would be an absolute page turning must read, because it's full of like absolutely astonishing passages of where to ensure freedom of movement for US contractors in Afghanistan, they would have to pay several different local feuding militias to leave them alone. So it's while employing other militias to protect them. And so it's just like, well, yeah, like we're going to pay these people to leave us alone, and we're going to pay these people to leave that group alone and us alone. And it just went on and on and on. And it was like, I can 100% see this happening in Syria. Now, there is another kind of historical parallel to draw, and so I've got an investigation forthcoming on this, is at the very start of the crisis in Syria in May 2011, which is before the military is deployed to deal with the foreign created crisis in Syria. Some MI6 and CIA people set up an organization called the Commission for International Justice and Accountability and they excuse me, their MO was to hold Syrian government officials to account for war crimes. Now, number one, this is set up before the wars even started. Number two, their business model was completely dependent on Western regime change to fell these leaders and bring them to trial, like Milosevic and other former Yugoslav military and political chiefs. Now, since the fall of Assad, this organization, which kind of rather disappeared from the radar and was also accused by the EU of having committed industrial scale fraud, and they've kind of appeared in the media again, and they're talking a really big game about holding Syrian officials to account for war crimes. And it's like, well, much like the fall of the Berlin Wall when the Stasi offices were occupied, we have all of this documentation on tap, and we can take these people to trial. But then it's like, well, if you do that though, with the existing government and what remains of its security and intelligence apparatus, you've effectively erased the state. So again, I can see if this does happen, it massively backfiring, much like the destruction of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. Led the country to descend into total chaos and tribal warring. But if they don't do it because of excuse me, because it would create too many problems in terms of navigating this new Syria, well, then that's another major defeat. I think that again, in the spirit of, it's like, I think it was Colin Powell who said, well, he applied this principle to Iraq, which was, if you break it, you bought it. And
well,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, they've certainly tried to buy it. I mean, the other point I wanted to raise about Afghanistan was they were there for 20 years, and as you said, all the documents that were released over many years now about economic development of Afghanistan, and there's this, even with like a country which has got loads of rare earth metals in it, they didn't manage to build anything. They didn't even manage to really asset strip it because the place was too unstable and none of their own companies would take the risk of actually investing there. Since in the 3 years since the collapse now of the American-led regime, the Chinese and the Russians are actually going in and are actually building things with the full cooperation of the Taliban-led administration. So it turns out that these imperialists now, like, they're not even prepared to do the minimal investment to actually industrialize an area in order that you can rip it off. Like, they're literally just looking for a payoff and then departing. They're too degenerate even to build anything. And the same will likely be true here. But before we move on to a serious story, which is the events in occupied Korea, I wanted just to have your take on a slightly more entertaining thing, which is, of course, the abysmal take machine of the British left when it comes to the Syrian crisis. You may be familiar with some of the players involved in this. We covered Agent Mason last week and his ravings. He has been running around as high as a kite. I haven't bothered to catch up with him, but we've got his junior here, his office junior, Mr. Jones, a man who attacks you from behind a block, a man who put out a bitchy post about me criticizing him also behind a block, and here he is. He's been, by the way, I have a forthcoming critique of Owen Jones and his writing career, which I didn't want to have to do, but given that apparently thousands of people still listen to the little bastard, I thought it best to do something, an hour's program about just spelling out how much of a scumbag he is and the kind of things that he has supported over his miserably long career in The Guardian. So essentially, he continues his decade-long screaming call for Assad to go, and he concludes with this: Assad was no anti-imperialist fighter. He's a mass-murdering gangster who deserved to have been toppled by the 2011 protests he brutally attacked. By the way, that's the same line they used about mass-murdering gangster. They used that line on Milosevic. I remember it. I remember that this was the press coverage of him. They've used it on Putin, used it on Saddam Hussein. They've used it against the Iranian government. It's always the same. This is a bit of ironic that a supporter of British imperialism would use that language, given the amount of very real gangsters that British imperialism has employed over the years. But your reactions to Owen, I guess you're not really surprised, Kit.
Well, I mean, number one, you've just triggered a memory of I think it was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which referred to the Milosevic family as the Sopranos of the Balkans.
These people are really real fucking imaginative, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, yeah, that, like, look, Owen Jones is, I am Kit's total lack of surprise at his the evolution of his responses to this, which is when fighting kicked off, he reverted to type. He was a key tub thumper for the end of Assad, and was, branding anyone who was opposed to the dirty war as an apologist for mass murder and genocide and a shill for dictatorship and persecution and all this other rubbish. He was shrieking with delight when he finally got what he'd always wanted, which is the removal of Assad. And then, like 24 hours later, he's complaining about Israel's incursions into Syria. And Zara Sultana, who many...
Next slide.
Yes, many continue to, for whatever reason, see as the left's great white hope within the Labour Party, did exactly the same thing. She was like, thank God he's gone. The Syrians can live free again. And then it's like, oh no, the inevitable upshot of what I was calling for and supported is now happening, and that's awful.
Here's the meme: how it started, how it's going, which is now Netanyahu's Greater Israel is unfolding, seizing Syrian land in Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, unchecked by the international community. I mean, I have gone beyond thinking that these people are just stupid, even though I know for a fact that they are. This is just mendacious shit, because you cannot, if you are aware of Netanyahu's plans or Smotrich's plans or Ben Gvir's ravings. Like, you cannot look at their plans and be aware of them and conclude that the best thing to do is to collapse the Syrian state, because they will do exactly what they have done, which is seize loads of land unopposed. Now, they will probably have great difficulty holding on to that, but they will try to keep hold of it for quite some time. So all of these people's protestations for the last year about supporting Palestine and all that, and being opposed to the dreadful Netanyahu, I mean, I'll just go ahead and say, I mean, you will obviously have your own take on this. I say that was all completely insincere, because it was. Because you cannot say you support the Palestinian cause whilst at the same time objectively holding a position which strengthens the very person you are saying is the devil. You know? So what is it? What is the priority here? I know these people aren't particularly intelligent, but even Sarah Sultana or Richard Burgon or Jeremy Corbyn, who's also been appalling on this, we should know very well, if you disappear the Syrian state, who is in the most immediate advantageous place? Well, it's Netanyahu, and it's Erdogan as well, but mostly Netanyahu. So there you go. The great white hope of the left. It has the same position on this as Tony Blinken.
Yeah, and I might add as well that, like, I mean, this is a point I've made since the very start of this, since the very start of the Gaza genocide, which is that, like, look, irrespective of whatever Owen Jones or the Novara media lot, with some like mild exceptions, whatever they say or report on the Gaza genocide, they should not be listened to and cannot be forgiven for their role in the Labour anti-Semitism psyop, for whitewashing Israel's previously slow motion, now turbocharged genocide of the Palestinians, and more generally for completely fudging the entire issue of Israel-Palestine. Now, my friends Louis Alday and Asa Winstanley have written for years about how Owen Jones is a tool of, like, the Zionist lobby, and, like, you know, I've even, you know, people who I credit with more intelligence than this, and you know, people I respect personally and politically, have actually been taken in by Novara and Owen Jones' Damascene conversion to the cause of the Palestinians. But I mean, number one, you got to bear in mind that, like, you know, these people are beholden to their subscribers on YouTube and Substack, and, you know, and many of those people will support the Palestinian struggle for freedom. So of course they have to, you know, play to their gallery in order to, you know, maintain some credibility with their audiences. But just more generally as well, is that, like, actually, when you break down their positions on Israel, I mean, aside from some stuff that Aaron Bastani, who I see is now praising Yolani for political organization, I mean, it's just absolutely unreal. But like, I mean,
coming soon, fully automated luxury Salafism.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh God, I read that book. God, it's awful. But the point is that, like, aside from some stuff that Bastani said at the very start of this, which echoed what people who actually know what they're talking about have been saying for ages, which is that, you know, that no other state in the world is allowed to behave like this, and that basically that their analysis is effectively, when you break it down, like liberal Zionism, right? Yes. Which effectively states, well, we want the Jews and the Arabs to get along, but within the framework of a apartheid state, right? Yeah. Like, so, which is the fundamental essence of what Zionism is. It is an ideology which is based on land theft, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and, you know, much and yes, apartheid. And so I've seen this recently, particularly in the US, where like, there are Zionist organizations, because Israel is such a pariah and has just destroyed 99% of what remaining sympathy it had, even in the mainstream. You know, that, like, due to their actions since October 7th last year, not that this was anything new, is that, like, Zionist lobby organizations are effective, have now kind of changed tack in the way that they approach these things, which is they were very keen to say, oh yeah, like, oh, criticize the government of Israel all you like, you know, please do. This is not about pushing Zionism. This is we believe in peaceful coexistence. But actually, if you criticize the ideology which undergirds Israel's very existence and its activities on a daily basis, then that's anti-Semitic.
Yes.
And I think that it's a few years old now, but I would strongly recommend that people watch this. It's an interview between Alexei, the mighty, the unimpeachable Alexei Sale, and Owen Jones. Now, of course, Alexei Sale is a committed communist, and B, Jewish, and it's really interesting to see Owen Jones talk to someone who. And this is before the Gaza genocide popped off. So this is before he has his actually I support the Palestinian mask on, right? Where he Alexei Sale, in a very patient and indeed measured way, basically, and polite as well. I mean, amazingly polite. Calls Owen Jones out consistently on his bullshit over the Labour is anti-Semitic psyop, and. Owen Jones is kind of left flailing, saying, well, okay, yeah, the party isn't institutionally anti-Semitic. Yeah, I guess kind of that's true. But there are some supporters of Jeremy Corbyn who are potentially anti-Semitic because they oppose Israel. And it's just like, it's like watching someone repeatedly walk into a glass door. Because he knows that he can't, because of his political connections and the fact that he's allowed on the BBC and in the Guardian, that he knows that he can't admit or acknowledge the truth. Yes. And he needs to stick to this narrative despite the fact that it has been completely decimated and dissected in front to his face. And it's I just think it's just very interesting to consider that we had the same people who were all in on throwing Jeremy Corbyn under the bus, and in this kind of mealy-mouthed, well, Jeremy Corbyn might not be anti-Semitic, but everyone he supports politically is. That kind of both sidesing, kind of Orwellian phrasing and framing. And it's we fast forward to today, and these same people are now claiming to be, the saviors of Palestine, while also, in the case of Aaron Bastani, reporting Palestinian refugees to the police for wearing badges that had paragliders on, and watermelons, in solidarity with Palestine.
Well, that man, I encountered him once a number of years ago. I figured him for a total fraud back then. He has more than lived up to my expectations since then. And now, to jump off what you were saying, all these people have a position which is essentially the same position as the British Foreign Office. Really?
Yeah.
Because the British Foreign Office have said for a long time, we support a two-state solution, we support harmony in the Middle East, etc., etc. They'll even go so far as to criticize the Netanyahu regime from time to time. But essentially, that's the line of the British Foreign Office is the line that the official leadership of the Palestine Solidarity Movement will go up to, and no further. And that's been the case for a long time. That most of the protest movement associated with the Palestine cause is led by people who will not step outside of the establishment framing whatsoever. Those that do, like Sarah Wilkinson of Palestine Action and others, get arrested. But if you echo essentially what David Lammy says, then you'll be allowed still to come on the BBC, because you're essentially going on and reaffirming what is British government policy anyway. But to turn away from Mr. Jones and Mr. Bastani and others to a more serious prospect, Kit, to round off the show for today. We spoke briefly the other week about the failed coup in South Korea. More has now emerged here, which is really a remarkable story, because what came out during hearings at the South Korean parliament yesterday was that the South Korean president, Yoon Suk-yeol, who, as we've covered before, is a cringing and pathetic servant of US imperialism to the extent he does karaoke with Joe Biden. I mean, just cringe does not cover that. But he tried this coup, which appeared to go very badly for him, and was broadly defeated by, it seems like, a vote in Parliament, which he tried to prevent but failed to do so. More details have now come out after the impeachment and resignation of an arrest of his defense minister, that this was actually a much more serious operation than it first appeared. There was an attempt going to be made via a special forces unit of the South Korean army to kidnap opposition lawmakers, but to do so with this unit disguised as troops from the DPRK. Now, quite how troops from the DPRK would make it all the way into central Seoul in uniform, nobody seems to have considered that. But the idea was that they would be kidnapped, according to some accounts, possibly executed, and then the special forces unit which did the kidnapping then wipes out themselves in a grand provocation strategy, which can only be designed to try and restart the Korean War and also justify the complete seizure of power by a military regime with Yoon Suk-yeol as its nominal head. So this is a very remarkable story, which has been followed up with the former defense minister, Kim Yong-hyun, taking the what I can only describe as the Epstein route, which is now he's in prison. He apparently tried to strangle himself with his own underwear. A likely story. But given the influence of the US imperialism over what he's occupied Korea, and given that they effectively command the South Korean army and intelligence networks, like, am I jumping the gun when I say that this is a plan that, if it wasn't made in the US, was certainly signed off on in the US?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think that, it's just all of it's just completely insane. And I think, there is a very interesting Twitter thread by Blue Roof Politics, which is just, it delves into the lurid details of this, where it's quite clear. I mean, this has been in the pipes for a very, very, very long time. But I mean, I think as well that we quite rightly refer to the illegitimate Republic of Korea as being effectively a total US puppet state, which is, under South Korean law, its military can be called by commanded by the US at any time for any reason. So there's no way that that planning for this didn't. If it didn't originate in Washington, it wasn't signed off in Washington. But I do think that this is a sign of not only is the coup's failure, but also the fact that they were trying to pull this in the first place is a sign of really severe issues with US power in Southeast Asia. Because, like we discussed on the last show, South Korea has existed, as effectively like a colonial child of the US empire since the Korean War, and it has been well aware that its days are numbered, and indeed completely dependent on the government is completely dependent on US support just to exist, because it is illegitimate, and effectively the state itself is not popular with South Koreans. If you look at polls, South Koreans are not very happy. They have virtually zero birth rate at all, and all sorts of other rather unsavory kind of societal issues, which is quite common feature in US colonies. But as I mentioned in the last week, and I've been thinking about writing about this, that in the 1970s there was a scandal called Koreagate, which was in which the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, no prizes for guessing who created and runs that, they were bribing businessmen and attempting to bribe US politicians, because Jimmy Carter pledged to withdraw military forces from the South. And that would have meant the almost total disintegration of the Republic of Korea. And as I mentioned last week, it would not be the Republic of Korea's political and economic system that would endure in the event of unification with North Korea. So they are very well aware that their position is fragile and under serious threat. Now, I think that in lieu of, I mean, in the 1980s, we may well have seen, this have been pulled off, and a formal kind of US invasion and subsequent peacekeeping occupation of the Republic of Korea occur. But I think the fact that they went for this it's a demonstration of the fact that the state is collapsing in on itself, and also the US does not have the muscle to go in for like an actual war. Would it defend, say, the Republic of Korea in the event of a quote unquote North Korean invasion, which is to say a reunification and the withering of this fake illegitimate and unpopular puppet state. So I mean, I would recommend people read this entire thread, because yes, it's quite clear it embarrassingly failed within a few hours, and yes, it seems to have rather backfired on the people who plotted it. But they've been planning this for a very long time. And I think that a lot of people are currently dooming about the implications of the collapse of Syria for the war in Ukraine, for BRICS, for the multipolar world. I mean, actually, the Syria was in many ways kind of low-hanging fruit for all of the reasons that we have been discussing during this broadcast. Empires don't die quietly. And I think that as part of a kind of wider Empire Strikes Back effort to reassert itself internationally and reassert itself over its imperial holdings, this coup was probably put into action in the hope that it would maybe lure the North Koreans into a trap. It would, yes, kind of ensure the existence of this puppet state in the Republic of Korea for another half century, perhaps, or at least as a few years, and it backfired absolutely spectacularly. I mean, the empire is thoroughly weakened, and as you pointed out in your excellent thread that you posted in the wake of Assad's fall, is we cannot, as anti-imperialists, afford to get complacent. I mean, the empire has been unraveling at such a rate, at such a pace and scale, to an extent that a lot of people don't even know. They're not even because it's so rapid that stuff gets kind of lost in the quagmire, so to speak. That basically there is a large number of people who think, well, we can just sit back and spectate and kind of act as real-time obituarists for the US empire, because it's on this inevitable and irreversible downward trajectory. It is, but that doesn't mean that it won't lash out, flail, and go out swinging. And I think that particularly, I mean, you mentioned my position in where I'm based. I know a lot of people in Serbia because of the US. Yugoslavia was where the unipolar world effectively started, with the US unilaterally destroying this country just for its own, just because it wanted to, and they got away with all of it. Is that there's a large number of people I know who are extremely worried about the US lashing out at them, at Serbia or at other countries within the former Yugoslavia. This does remain a risk. So on top of remaining very vigilant and not falling into complacency and thinking that we can just have our sit eating popcorn and watching the US collapse in real time, we need to be involved in serious organizing and action. On top of exposing and monitoring this stuff, we need to be continuing to construct and work towards alternatives. Now, it's in Syria, for instance, them being locked out of the Western financial system and under heavy sanctions, it wasn't until relatively recently that they moved towards integrating with BRICS and seeking alternative investment from China for reconstruction. I mean, that's relatively recently. And one of the responses to that was that European countries, European governments started calling for normalization of relations with Syria in around September this year, which I think is one of the reasons that they went for this, because they wanted to get rid of Assad just permanently and remove any prospect of reintegrating Syria into the international community, quote unquote. But it's that is from the perspective of the Syrians and Assad's personal perspective as president of Syria, that's 5 years too late. That's 10 years too late. And we didn't get into it in the show, and I think we'll probably cover it next week as we're running out of time. The battle continues elsewhere, and we discussed last week the kind of growing axis of resistance in Africa, where you have former French colonies in West Africa like Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, but also now Senegal, and trying to get rid of the French and also get rid of US military bases on their territory. Now, it was reported in the midst of the collapse of the Syrian government that the government in Niger had seized forcibly French companies operating on their territory that were siphoning off valuable resources, including uranium, of course, paying locals nothing for their labor, using private security goons to crack down on strikes, and just sapping all this resource wealth for themselves, with Niger getting a pittance. They have forcibly seized control of the means of production in many areas. David Hundayan, this independent African journalist, who is very much worth following. He's absolutely superb. Maybe we'll get him on the show sometime. His response to the fall of Assad was, African governments, you need to start arming yourselves and preparing, because it could be, as Gaddafi said, it could be you next. Now, I'm certainly not an advocate of violence, and neither is David, but we need to start building these alternatives now. If you are worried about the empire, but if you think that the empire could lash out at you, then what are you waiting for? You can't wait for it to happen to try and do something, because by the time it's happened, it's often too late.
Yes, and the other thing is that in this stage of advanced decay, even more so than in the past, you can't negotiate with the imperialists, because they require only the total destruction and subjugation of these countries. So if you're going to go and start doing things like kicking out their military bases in your country, which you absolutely should, if you're going to nationalize industries that were previously owned by their monopolies, which you absolutely should, then you should expect them to first try and fund some sort of ethnic strife or jihadist operation if you're in an African country, which they're already doing in many of these places. But the only defense against that is not only a powerful military, but a unified, mobilized population, because that's the only reason, really, or the primary reason, that you have the DPRK surviving for so long. That and their self-sufficiency is the only reason that Venezuela and Nicaragua survive, despite being in the belly of the beast, so to speak. It is the fact that they have the masses mobilized behind them, and the opposition is revealed to be this pathetic collection of bourgeois and petty bourgeois scumbags who would sell the whole country for a Netflix subscription, basically. Because that's who's in power in Ukraine right now, basically, and who's in power in a number of places. So the only chance is to mobilize the population politically, and also in military terms, and be prepared to, as many liberation struggles have in the past, make the imperialists pay a cost they're not prepared to absorb. And that's the only way liberation comes. And it's a painful lesson that many people need to learn, but it's the lesson that people in the Algerians learn. It's the lesson that the Cubans managed to learn. It's the lesson that the Koreans learned, and the Vietnamese, and so many others, that the imperialists will make the price of liberation very expensive in human terms, but in actual fact, the cost of not fighting them is much higher. It is also in human terms. The cost of surrendering to them is gargantuan, just as Russia in the 90s proved. So I think this is a good point to bring our discussion today to a conclusion. But Kit, I'll give you the final word if you want to talk about anything in conclusion, or any particular things you want to point people to.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's it. I might add that I mentioned this on Twitter. I think that like YouTube has caught wind of the fact that we're doing this show and is now throttling us. Please like, share, subscribe, please comment, even if it's just for the purposes of algorithm, because the one of the ways that the empire is fighting back is via like mass censorship and suppression of dissenting viewpoints, such as you here on our show. So it's like, I mean, anything that you can do to potentially give us a boost, it would mean everything, because I mean, we all independent media is massively under attack, and it's a small thing, but it can have massive positive consequences if you literally just type here for the algorithm under our videos. And please share. I think we've as I mentioned last week, we set up a Substack. We will be promoting our broadcast through there. We will be inviting reader questions, and potentially also posting show notes for when we have kind of link heavy broadcast, so to speak. But yeah, it's been real, guys. Thanks so much for joining us, and see you next week.
See you next time, everybody, and thank you.
Bye-bye.